Good evening. I am Joseph Castro, and I serve as the 8th president of California State University, Fresno. Mary and I are pleased to welcome you to tonight's event featuring renowned journalist Robert Costa. Our event today is a special gift to all of you for your support of our university. We are co-sponsoring tonight's event with Fresno State's Institute for Media and Public Trust, the Fresno Bee, Valley PBS, and KC24. And I appreciate our partnership with each of them. The purpose of the President's Lecture Series, which was established in 2016, is to bring national speakers to campus to further inform our community on matters that affect the Valley. For the first time in our series history, we are broadcasting today's event live and online, thereby expanding our audience and reaching well beyond the Central Valley to members of the CSU Board of Trustees, some of my fellow CSU presidents, and alumni from all across the nation and beyond. And I'm pleased to welcome back Robert Costa to our lecture series. Our timing for his visit could not be any better, given that all that is occurring now in Washington, D.C. Bob is both a national political reporter for the Washington Post and moderator of Washington Week on PBS. His daily reporting includes in-depth coverage of Congress and the White House. Bob holds a bachelor's degree in American Studies from the University of Notre Dame and a master's degree from the University of Cambridge. I also know that in his little bit of spare time, he enjoys different kinds of music. Since his first visit to campus in 2017, Bob has developed close ties with some of our students and faculty, especially those in journalism and political science. And earlier today, he spent some time with students and faculty answering some of their great questions, very insightful questions, keeping with his commitment to mentoring a new generation of leaders. Tonight's event will consist of two parts. First, Bob will provide insights and analysis from his years of reporting on national politics as the nation heads into the most consequential presidential election in recent history. After Bob's talk, audience members will be encouraged to submit questions for Bob's consideration. And Patty Wade, Fresno State's Director of University Communications, will moderate that part of the event. It always feels like a campus holiday when Bob is with us. Please join me in welcoming Bob Costa. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Dr. Castro. It's wonderful to be back, albeit virtually, with you and Mary and the entire Fresno State community. I know I'm not there. I would have loved to have been there, staying over in Clovis or in Fresno, but I do have my Fresno State Bulldogs, my mug, so this will be with me all evening. And it's really a pleasure to be back with the Fresno State community and the Fresno, California community. I travel all around the country as a political reporter, and there is no other place that has become kind of a second home for me like Fresno, California. Maybe it's because I went to college in the Midwest. There's a sensibility in Fresno I just connected with from day one when I was there visiting with you. But I have kind of a bipartisan history with political reporting on Fresno, California. The first time I really encountered Fresno was before I even got to know you, Dr. Castro or Mary. I was covering Congress, still am, and I was having lunch with Congressman Devin Nunes of California. This is probably 6 or 7 years ago. And he said to me, "I'm so glad to see a Portuguese reporter doing well." And I think I disappointed him very much when I said, "My name is Costa, but I am Italian and Irish." But he has still been friendly to me professionally ever since, and have a professional rapport with Congressman Nunes. Then because my last name is Costa, I would get questions from the California reporters in Washington. you must be related to Jim Costa. In fact, my own twin brother, my fraternal twin brother, is named Jim Costa. And Congressman Costa, to his credit, has always joked about this. And so whenever I see him in the halls of Congress, when things are normal and we're not all wearing face coverings in the middle of a pandemic, he'll yell at me, "Cousin, how you doing? Cousin." We are not related, but he does that to irritate me and poke some fun at me in a good way. He's still tough to get a good nugget of information out of as a reporter, same with Congressman Nunes. But I feel good. Not only do I have a relationship with Fresno State from some good visits and conversations with students over the years and with Dr. Castro, but I also have a good working rapport with both the Democrat and Republican from Fresno, California, representing Fresno in the House of Representatives. And thinking about California tonight, last time I was with you all in Fresno, California, I said, buckle up because we are all living through history. But I did not expect it to be this much history every hour, every day. I know if you're even tuning in for this, I appreciate it because I know how exhausting it must be to watch MSNBC or Fox News or CNN and follow it all on Twitter and on the web and read the newspaper. Jim Borens at Fresno State, former editor of the Fresno Bee, reading the Bee or whatever you read. There's a lot out there. But if you're in California tonight, this afternoon, and this evening, you have to feel like not only are you living through history, but you are in the center of history. And this was proven again just an hour ago. Speaker Pelosi from up north in San Francisco, she announced tonight that she is opening up what she's calling a 25th Amendment Commission. Talk about historic. She's doing this with a congressman I know from Maryland named Jamie Raskin. He's a constitutional scholar. And they've decided, because of President Trump's health and the lack of clarity as congressional leaders on it, that they want to set up a group to make recommendations about the 25th Amendment. Now, according to the Constitution, Congress does not have much of a say in removing a president from office. That is done under the 25th Amendment by having the vice president, sitting vice president, in this place it would be Vice President Mike Pence, come up with a joint agreement with the majority of the president's cabinet to say a president's disabled or unable to fulfill the constitutional duties of being commander-in-chief, of being the chief executive, and they can remove him from office under the 25th Amendment. It's never been done in American history, but history is upon us when you have the Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency behind the Vice President of the United States, setting up a formal commission tonight, and she'll announce it formally tomorrow morning on Friday, to investigate how can Congress advise the cabinet, advise the vice president about how to deal with this situation. Now, the speaker's critics will say she's doing this as a gambit ahead of the election, but Congressman Raskin, it should be noted, her partner on this project, has been working on this issue for years. In fact, in 2017, Congressman Raskin came up with legislation to provide a national commission on the 25th Amendment, because as a constitutional scholar, he believes that there is not enough clarity on what the thresholds should be for the cabinet, for the vice president to consider this kind of drastic action. It's unclear about what would meet the criteria under the Constitution to trigger these kind of discussions. And by having a bipartisan commission that includes health experts that are not affiliated with either party, Congressman Raskin, since 2017, has championed this idea of having Congress advise the executive branch. Now, the executive branch usually shrugs off Congress, if history is any guide, and that will probably be the circumstance here. You're not going to exactly see Vice President Mike Pence just 25 days before the election say, "Thank you very much, Speaker Pelosi, for your offer of help on removing the nominee of the party." But this could be an issue. If it's President Biden in 2021 or President Trump, and we are living in a pandemic where we also have elderly nominees. And so it will be interesting to see if any Republicans in the coming days sign on to the idea of not removing President Trump from office or recommending the use of the 25th Amendment, but of trying to get some clarity about what would ever provoke that situation. And this is why you really are living through history in California. We're all living through history in America. We've talked for 3.5 years now during my times at Fresno and my reporting in the Washington Post and on Washington Week about norms being shattered. I was joking with my colleagues at the Post today. I feel like we almost have to insert that sentence in every article we write. Once again, institutions challenged and norms are shattered. We hear that phrase a lot, but it's spot on. Norms are being shattered. Institutions are being challenged, from the government to the media to the military. And we also see the Constitution being tested, the testing of America in 2020. But it's not just Speaker Pelosi from San Francisco who has California front and center in this 2020 presidential race. It's also your two senators. Senator Feinstein, she is now the minority ranking member on the Senate Judiciary Committee. She will be the person leading the charge next week for the Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee as they consider the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, a federal judge from Indiana, to fill the vacancy left by the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I was talking on Washington Week a few months ago that this election was so wild, so crazy. The only thing that could make it crazier and wilder would be to have a vacancy on the Supreme Court. Well, we have one, and a rush confirmation process in October. And beyond that, we have the president's health, the hospitalization of a president at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. So Senator Feinstein, Speaker Pelosi, two veteran Democrats in the center of the arena. And so, of course, is Senator Harris. Just last night at the vice presidential debate in Salt Lake City, the first Black woman to ever be on a presidential ticket, a historic nomination that's galvanized Democrats, independent women and men nationwide who are open to her politics, but also excited to see someone with her profile, not only the first Black woman to be on a national ticket, but the first woman with South Asian heritage to be on a national ticket. And so we're seeing the fast-changing face and presentation of the American electorate now showcasing itself on the Democratic ticket. And she represents a new generation of Democrats that's coming up in places like California that are urging action on what they see as systemic issues in the country, such as racism, to systemic issues globally, like climate change. And she adds a lot of different political components to the Biden ticket, but also energy and that youthfulness compared to Vice President Biden, who, like President Trump, is over 70 years old, represents a different generation. And she, too, will be front and center next week as a sitting member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. What a perch for Senator Harris to not only be on the Democratic ticket, but to be in the Senate Judiciary Committee asking questions of a nominee just weeks before an election, days before an election. And it extends to the House of Representatives. You in the Central Valley know House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy so well. Kevin O's Deli, he started in the Valley years ago in Bakersfield. He was a staffer, a young conservative, a young Republican, gets elected to the state legislature. I've covered him for a long time. I wrote a profile of him 10 years ago, and he still has it, he says, in his office. I called him the dude because he reminded me of the Big Lebowski, if you've ever seen that movie. He was always easygoing. He has a kinetic energy in terms of collegiality and making members feel welcome. And McCarthy rose to the fore of Republican politics in 2010 as being the head of recruitment for the Republicans in the House. And he was this upstart from California, from the Central Valley, wasn't really known as a policy mind or a policy guy. That was for Paul Ryan at the time. And he wasn't really known as someone totally on the leadership track. That seemed to be Eric Cantor, the speaker in waiting. Yet McCarthy was the political organizer, the recruiter. He had that talent to get people to run for office. And McCarthy now, with his alliance with President Trump, has seen his career reach new heights. To be the minority leader of the House of Representatives is no joke, but it's also come at a cost potentially. It's very difficult for him at times because he's seen as very close to President Trump and all that represents in American politics. But McCarthy's bargain, based on my reporting, is that he sees the president as the president and he wants to work with the president. I don't think he loved the story I did on him in the Washington Post about a year ago. McCarthy is so known for getting to understand people's quirks and their personalities, whether they're a congressional recruit or the president of the United States. McCarthy went out of his way. This is no joke. You can read it on the Washington Post website now. It was a big front page story that he went to get individual Starbursts. I believe the president likes red and orange Starburst candy. And he put them in a big jar, just the colors the president likes, and got them to the president's desk. The president, of course, loved the gift. And that's classic Kevin McCarthy. Find a way to make it work politically. Don't think too much about the long-term historic ramifications. Get it done. Keep the party together. So you have this operator and this major figure in congressional politics from the Valley. And speaking of McCarthy being a recruiter, he is someone who for years has made David Valadao, your former congressman now running again against Democrat TJ Cox. He has made Valadao a priority for House Republicans. In race after race, you know it, you live there. Valadao has been someone McCarthy has put an emphasis on. He's gotten President Trump to throw his weight into Valadao's race. But what's so interesting is that McCarthy is a political strategist, and he works with Valadao to make sure that if Valadao is going to run and try to get the seat back from TJ Cox, that he's going to do it in a way that's going to win. And when you see David Valadao's campaign this fall in 2020, he's endorsed by President Trump. He's endorsed by Kevin McCarthy, but he's also using President Obama in campaign ads. One of the Valadao campaign ads, you might have seen it on local TV, shows Valadao talking about President Obama and the work he did in Congress with the Obama administration to secure water for the Central Valley, one of the key issues in the Central Valley. And to me as a reporter, that's fascinating because it reminds me a lot about how McCarthy navigates the Republican Party and how he helps other candidates navigate the Republican Party. In this day and age in the Republican Party, it's dominated by President Trump, but someone like David Valadao knows that if he really wants to win, he has to also reach out to those voters who maybe voted for President Trump and voted for President Obama. And that's what Valadao is trying to do. And TJ Cox, he's someone who's trying to have the energy of the left that's there in the party, it's there in California. But he also looks at someone like Congressman Costa, who's one of the most prominent blue dog, the moderate Democrats in the House. And he too, Congressman Cox, is trying to balance between the different pressure points in his own party, the ascendant left and the moderate wing, the Biden wing versus the AOC and Bernie wing. And when you watch that race, the Cook Political Report calls it a toss-up, the Fresno race between Cox and Valadao, the Valley race between Cox and Valadao. Larry Sabato, my friend down at the University of Virginia, says it leans Democratic. We'll see. But if you think about that, there's no other state like California to have the speaker and the minority leader in the House of Representatives, both from California, one of them from the Valley, two senators in the mix, one of them on the Democratic ticket, the other the preeminent player in the biggest issue in the Senate, the confirmation of Supreme Court justice, and the battle for not really control the Senate, those seats are solid blue, but the battle for the House, as Republicans try to make gains, it goes through people like McCarthy, and it comes through races like Valadao and Cox. And when I talk about that Valadao-Cox race and David Valadao's balancing act, it brings up something I've been covering in Washington very closely, which is the Republican Party and the Trump era. And on the front page of today's Washington Post, I filed a story about how the GOP right now, in the voices and eyes of Republicans themselves, this is not my opinion, I'm a reporter, but my sources privately and now publicly are starting to detect an unraveling. They're seeing a Republican Party that for 5 years, 3.5 for sure during the Trump presidency, but really since President Trump took control politically of the party in the nomination process in late 15 and 16, this is a Republican Party that has bought into President Trump as someone who can help them reclaim the political map. And I saw it up close as a reporter in 2016 when I traveled across the state of Pennsylvania, traveled to Wisconsin in the closing days of that campaign, and I saw President Trump rouse the grievances of working people, white voters in the suburbs, and put together a new coalition. He almost stitched together the old Reagan Democrat coalition, and he was able to win states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that Republicans had not won since the late 1980s. And President Trump was able to rack up the numbers in the exurbs of places like Wisconsin, the exurbs of Milwaukee and Philadelphia, and really get numbers. And at places like Scranton, Pennsylvania, in the Northeast or the western side of Wisconsin, where you had traditionally Democratic kind of union voters, he was able to pull them toward him. And he was able to win by a narrow margin in these states because as he got unexpectedly big numbers in the rural Democratic areas and in the exurb and kind of Republican suburbs, he was also able to keep the vote pretty steady for the Republicans, traditional Republicans in the suburbs, closer to the cities, still came out for the Republican nominee. And most importantly, in many of these states, such a narrow win for President Trump in 2016 in the Electoral College. He won steadily in the Electoral College, but only a few thousand votes across the country really put him across the line in winning some of these key states, is the Democratic coalition was not at the level it needed to be for Secretary Clinton in the cities. And that's why Vice President Biden is targeting places, along with Senator Harris, like Detroit, Michigan, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Columbus, Ohio, even Austin, Texas, and Dallas, Atlanta, Georgia. And they're trying to say, we got to get that Obama coalition from 2008 and 2012 back. And the Democrats, right now, the polls show they're in a terrific position, but it's very still early. This was still the Access Hollywood moment in 2016. And the Democrats aren't taking anything for granted, but they do feel good. I was talking to sources in the Biden campaign, including Jen O'Malley Dillon in recent days and weeks. She's the campaign manager for Joe Biden. And they're looking at places that haven't been on the Democratic map since Bill Clinton, a man of the South from Arkansas, won the presidency in 1992 and 1996. They're now looking at Georgia and Texas, South Carolina, probably out of reach for Biden, but that Senate race in South Carolina, hyper competitive between Democrat Jamie Harrison and Senator Lindsey Graham, a staunch ally of President Trump. But what we're seeing right now in the GOP, and I wrote about this in today's paper, is what I framed as kind of a slow pulling of the thread and unraveling, as Douglas Brinkley, the presidential historian, put it to me, because you're seeing Republicans in almost an impossible position in these battlegrounds. A state like Arizona, in Texas, is becoming a battleground. These senators see the whole Senate majority for the Republicans at risk. And they're trying to say to themselves, how do I make sure I appeal to independent voters in the suburbs and elsewhere, but make sure that I don't become too closely associated with President Trump? Because if President Trump's approval ratings continue to plummet, that's not the path to reelection. There's a fear that President Trump may be able to reclaim his own popularity. He's such a unique political figure that he can maybe figure a way to save himself. But the party and the candidates who are more traditional Republicans, they're not going to be able to have those political gymnastics at the end of a campaign to really figure this out. And so as a reporter, what I try to do is take a whole look at the map and to figure out what's happening out there, because it's chaos every day. We're all trying to go through this political storm and figure it out. But it's my full-time job to sit there and look at the clues and to say what's really happening. And what I saw in recent days is Senator John Cornyn, a conservative from Texas. He said to the Houston Chronicle editorial board that President Trump, quote, got over his skis, made some mistakes on the pandemic. That struck me. John Cornyn, the former number 2 in the U.S. Senate, alongside McConnell, someone who doesn't say anything without meaning it, he's gently criticizing President Trump in the closing days of the campaign on the pandemic. Notable, but it's one data point. Then we saw on Tuesday night in Arizona, Martha McSally, a senator who in style and in policy has been in lockstep with President Trump, a military veteran. She became notable earlier in the year for clashing with my friend at CNN, Manu Raju, who's a frequent guest on Washington Week. She called him fake news, an unfair jibe in the halls of the Senate. And that got her a lot of attention on the right, that she was someone mimicking or echoing President Trump in his attacks on the press. And she believed, based on my reporting, that being with President Trump was the way to win re-election. But what we've seen in Arizona is President Trump has been able to close the gap a little bit in the polls. And so is Senator McSally, but it's not easy. She's still behind Mark Kelly, the retired astronaut, the husband of Gabrielle Giffords, the congresswoman who was shot and had to leave her seat in Congress. He's now running, has raised millions and millions of dollars, one of the best Democratic fundraisers in the country. And at this debate on Tuesday, McSally's asked this question. You got to go watch the video if you get a chance. And she's asked, are you proud of President Trump? Are you proud to stand with President Trump? And she says, I'm proud to work for Arizona. As political an answer as you can get. She didn't want to really answer the question directly, reminded me a bit of the vice presidential debate last night. No one seemed to want to answer Susan Page's questions directly. Typical politics. But McSally, she's data point 2. And then you see across the congressional ranks now, from Senator Susan Collins to Senator Lindsey Graham, tied in the latest Quinnipiac poll in his Senate race. Senator Susan Collins down in her Senate race in Maine. They're speaking out against the president on the congressional stimulus. They see millions of people hurting in the country, thousands suffering in their states, not being able to pay their rent checks, not being able to really survive economically amid a global pandemic that has slowed businesses everywhere. And they're pleading with the president to come back to the negotiating table with your fellow Californian Speaker Pelosi to get something done. And when they speak out, the White House listens, at least the White House does. Does President Trump? It's hard to say. And that's one issue that I've been reporting in the last 24 hours is what's the president really up to here with the stimulus? Because, give me 1 minute here. I called up my sources at the White House and in the GOP, and I said, what's the president doing walking away from a congressional stimulus deal? And they said, well, he's doing what he has always done. And they pointed to his book, the bestseller, The Art of the Deal. And if you haven't read it, the core of that book comes down to this. President Trump, when he was Mr. Trump on the 26th floor of Trump Tower, throughout his real estate career, always took the extreme position at first and then hoped someone would move or blink on the other side and come to the center. And they said that's what he's doing here. But what we've seen is that the president took that extreme position, negotiating-wise, walked away from the table a couple days ago. The markets dropped. They dropped significantly. And then the White House changed its tune within hours. They started to say, we need to do a piecemeal agreement. Then they said, we need to do something for the airlines. So you're seeing the markets recover in the last day or so a bit. They've recovered because they now believe the White House is starting to show some shoots of compromise and how they're working with the Democrats. Speaker Pelosi, though, is still driving a hard bargain. She believes the country needs a $2 trillion deal, not the $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion that the White House has been talking about. But as a reporter, I do see some optimism if you're seeking a deal at this point, if you yourself are looking for federal economic relief. And I'll give you the reason why. Mark Meadows, the conservative congressman who's now chief of staff of the White House, has been driving the negotiations for months on the GOP side. She's also, to put it bluntly, been driving the speaker and her allies crazy because he is a conservative who has stuck to his conservative points. And the speaker, her associates tell me, doesn't like Mr. Meadows too much. And she wants to cut a deal with Secretary Mnuchin again. And Secretary Mnuchin's a former Democrat, the Treasury Secretary. He cut that major deal with Speaker Pelosi back in March. They called it the HEROES Act. And so one reason the markets are recovering in the last day or so is because they see Secretary Mnuchin back on the scene, meeting with Speaker Pelosi. And so that means that a stimulus deal could happen. But there's so many variables at this point. I mean, what a wild time we're living in politically, where the Speaker of the House, on one hand, is starting a 25th Amendment commission about the president's fitness for office and concerns about his health, raising the biggest constitutional questions. On the other hand, she is potentially ready to cut a deal or moving toward cutting a deal with Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin for trillions of dollars on federal economic relief. That just tells you everything about the time we're living in. It also tells you a lot about Speaker Pelosi. I've had the chance to sit down with her quite a bit in recent months. She's been kind to me in the Washington Post. And at 80 years old, never forget, this is someone who comes out of Baltimore. Her father, Thomas D'Alessandro, the mayor of Baltimore. Her brother was mayor. This is a political person, and I mean that in a favorable way. Someone who knows how to count votes. She used to sit there with her mother and her father in a Catholic house in Baltimore years ago in the 50s and in the 60s, and she would count votes, and she would help her father run different wards and figure out the map of the city of Baltimore. She has carried that skill into Congress. There's no one sharper in terms of understanding the dynamics of members than Speaker Pelosi. And so I think a deal could be done. And this Amy Coney Barrett nomination is going to be something to watch next week. She's a graduate of Notre Dame Law School, and her faith could come back to the foreground as abortion is discussed. And one thing to pay attention to, if you're interested in abortion rights or against abortion rights, is to listen closely to how questions are asked. And I've sat down with Democrats and Republicans, such as Senator Ted Cruz in recent days, to get prepared as a reporter for the hearings. And what you're going to have to listen to is a question. This is maybe a bit of a piece of advice. Listen for the question about Brown versus the Board of Education. Sounds a little bit out of left field, right? That was settled years ago. Almost no one in the country, at least in elected politics and at the congressional level, would ever oppose Brown versus Board desegregation. But look for Amy Coney Barrett to be asked about the precedent of Brown versus Board and whether she agrees with the precedent that's set and the precedent of desegregation in Brown versus Board. Because what Democrats and maybe some Republicans, conservatives, are going to try to do is to get Coney Barrett to come out of talking in bland and vanilla ways about her judicial philosophy and to get specific. And the thought is, among Republicans and Democrats who really want to pry some clarity out of her, is that if they can ask about Brown versus Board, which seems like a pretty much yes or no answer on precedent, then they can ask her also about the precedent of Roe v. Wade, that landmark abortion rights law from the 1970s. And that's why I love politics and I love covering Congress along with the White House and the campaigns, because everything's on the line. If you care about abortion rights, you want to know if this judge, who could become a justice, is going to try to remove Roe v. Wade or rule against it in some ways that allow states to have more control over abortion rights. And if you're a conservative like Josh Hawley of Missouri, the fast-rising conservative who may run for president in 2024, he's on judiciary. He may ask her about precedent as well to try to see where she really stands. And most times, these judicial nominees are pretty evasive. They look at John Roberts, the Chief Justice, as a model. If you remember his confirmation hearings in 2005 under President George W. Bush, Roberts came up with the phrase that we hear a lot now in Supreme Court nominations. I'm just an umpire, they say. I call balls and strikes. I don't have an ideology. I'm just an umpire. And most senators now will smile when they hear that, because that's the Roberts line, the line to escape getting too specific. And the vice presidential debate was really a fascinating window to me. And I've covered Vice President Pence for quite some time. And when you talk to him and his allies, his role is really to make sure that Republican Party that's nervous tonight about the polls, that's nervous about President Trump, and that they come out and that they know that President Trump, as the VP articulated, provided conservatives with an overhaul of the federal judiciary, that he provided them with an overhaul of the tax code. And that Republican Party, Pence, his goal was to reach out to people in places like Pennsylvania by talking about fracking, by taking on the Biden record and framing it as liberal. But he also wanted to say to Republicans, remember, even if you don't love President Trump's character, even if you don't love everything he's done with the pandemic, he's a conservative who will provide conservative policy. But what about the Democrats? What kind of policy would they have in 2021? To be sure, it's actually an open question. Vice President Biden has said he wants to, quote, build back better. That's his economic plan. But on some issues like packing the Supreme Court, he has been relatively mute, hasn't given a clear answer. Neither did Senator Harris in the vice presidential debate. And that non-answer, that evasiveness on that particular question, it's actually pretty revealing, because you see Vice President Biden and Senator Harris not wanting to answer it, because if they answer that they support court packing, which means expanding the Supreme Court beyond the traditional 9 justices in order to have more justices, and the Democrats would believe they could compete with this conservative majority by adding more liberal justices and under a Democratic president. If Biden and Harris say they support court packing, my Democratic strategist sources tell me they fear they'll alarm suburban voters who will see that as a radical idea. And Biden wants to be anything but radical to those suburban voters and other voters around the country who voted for President Trump in 2016 because they thought the Democrats were moving too far left. But Vice President Biden, I'm told by his top allies, also doesn't want to say he doesn't support court packing. Because if he gives the other answer that he doesn't support court packing, he'll have liberal Democrats frustrated that he's not taking a position that they want on the court. Liberals want to see the Supreme Court expanded. They're furious with Majority Leader McConnell holding back the Merrick Garland nomination. They want changes. They want to pack the Supreme Court. And so Biden fears, I'm told, that if he says he doesn't want to pack the court, then the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party will stay home in some places, will lack the enthusiasm that he needs. Because to come back to what I was talking about at the start, he needs the energy, he needs the enthusiasm in the cities, in the college towns like Fresno, like Ann Arbor, Michigan, Madison, Wisconsin. He needs that energy to make sure he wins in some of these battlegrounds, helps the Democrats win the Senate and win the House. And the Republican Party is the story I write about all the time, but I've spent a lot of time covering Senator Sanders. And let's not forget about that Democratic story, because it was only 5 years ago I was on Capitol Hill and Senator Sanders announced his presidential run, and even the tourists, he made the announcement outside, even the tourists didn't pay attention. They wondered, who is this wild-haired professor speaking outside of the Capitol? What was he, a protester? No, he was a U.S. Senator from Vermont, an independent, a Democratic socialist. And 5 years ago, only 5 years ago, Democratic socialism, like the nationalism on the right, Democratic socialism was considered a fringe idea, something that you didn't really talk about. But now it's at the fore of Democratic politics. And if Vice President Biden wins, he may try to, as he says now, govern in a bipartisan way, but he'll have pressure from Representative Ocasio-Cortez, from Senator Sanders, who will say to him, Mr. President Biden, we were with you when it counted. We came together when we used to sit on our hands. We came together to elect you. You owe us fair consideration of Medicare for all, or at least a full-throated commitment to a public option on health care. More action on climate change. If not the Green New Deal, we want more. And if they don't get what they want, they could make the president, if he's Biden, pay a price. So what a time to be in California. I know it's very tough if you're in college. I was speaking with the students at Fresno State earlier today. My heart breaks for college students who are having to live through a pandemic and not have the fun of a college experience at Fresno State. I've been to Fresno State. I know how great it can be. I've been to football games there. I've been on campus. And to not have the joy of college life, I know we have to put, as we should, frontline workers and doctors and patients and those who have died from COVID in our hearts, and they should be the priority. But let's not forget, the college students are still hurting, and the communities are hurting around them, their families, with the economy. And then the wildfires in California. I mean, to have all of this happening, I hope if you aren't engaged in politics, you're certainly engaged now, and you'll become engaged even more. There's so much to discuss. I mean, I could go on for hours. I never stop talking about this stuff with my colleagues at the Post or at PBS, because we really are living through history. And we have a president who now they're talking about the 25th Amendment in Congress, a president not committed to the peaceful transfer of power, institutions like the media, my own institution, the media, under siege. Even though we go back to the First Amendment, people across the country, they love us, some don't trust us. We have to make sure we keep our institutional integrity. All of these different currents colliding together. I can only say that I hope whenever this ends, whenever it gets a little bit more calm and things go back to normal, and there's hopefully a vaccine, that I can come back to Fresno to go to Just Joe's and to stay in Clovis or Fresno and have some of that. I forget I'm blanking on it now, but the great steak, the kind of steak I have out there all the time. I forget. You guys will remind me. But anyway, and we'll get together next time when I'm out there in Fresno. But I want to have a conversation now And Patty Wade from Dr. Castro's office will moderate the conversation, because for me, it's so important to hear from all of you. I've been traveling a little bit during the pandemic. I traveled to Odessa, Texas. You might remember Friday Night Lights. I travel with the vice president to different places. I've traveled with the president and vice president on a plane because you get tested for coronavirus before you get on. So it seems like a relatively safe place to travel. I haven't been on a commercial flight. Now, when I'm not so sure, that there's some reporters now who won't even go to the White House because it's seen as a super spreader area. We can get into that a little bit more. But I want to hear what you have to say, because I'm missing that tactile experience, the experience of talking to voters as a reporter. There's nothing more important than in the close of a campaign to hear from the people who make the decisions, the voters. It's not the media, it's not the politicians, it's the American voter. All of you in Fresno, if you're elsewhere watching, and I miss that very much. So tonight is at least an opportunity for me anecdotally to hear from all of you. So Patty, I'll turn it over to you, and let's start our conversation.
That sounds great. Thanks so much, Bob, for that analysis. I think it's tri-tip steak that you were looking for.
Tri-tip, that's exactly
Tri-tip.
right.
Between tri-tip and linguiça, I think those are the two.
I've had linguiça. Linguiça is the Portuguese sausage.
Right.
Yes, that's
Exactly.
very good. I've had that too. That's great.
Exactly. Well, thank you for that, Bob. And I just wanted to welcome the audience again to the Fresno State President's Lecture Series. It's a pleasure to have Bob Costa here again with us. And audience members, we are going to be taking your questions, so feel free to begin submitting them through the Q&A. And as your moderator, I will read them aloud to Bob and give him a chance to share his perspective with us. So while you are submitting your questions to Q&A, Bob, I just thought I'd reminisce a year ago when you were here, you were talking about your trip to Poland with Vice President Pence. And this was shortly before everything started coming out around Ukraine. And I just found it fascinating what you shared with our audience around being in the windowless hotel room with John Bolton and Vice President Pence, along with the Ukrainian president. So it's those nuggets that we hear from you that really provide such interesting insights and ultimately leads to more interesting news as we read it based on what you share with us. So I appreciate that.
Sure.
And sure
I'll just
enough,
tell you one.
Yes.
I'll tell you one quick story about how so much in life, the famous Faulkner quote, "The past is never past. It's not even past." So Bob Woodward has been a real mentor to me at the Washington Post, and which is a thrill. I mean, sometimes it's hard because he's become a friend and a mentor, but to think this guy I would watch as the character Robert Redford, he never lets you forget Robert Redford played him, but he was Robert Redford in All the President's Men. Bob Woodward, Watergate. He and I have had the opportunity to interview President Trump together. And during our March 2016 interview of President Trump, then candidate Trump, we were sitting there in the still incomplete Trump Hotel in Washington. And it was fun for me to watch Trump watch Woodward, Woodward interview Trump. And I was sitting there doing a joint interview. And Woodward really pressed candidate Trump on who he really is. What's he about? What is he really going to do if he wins? And one thing I love about Woodward, and he taught me this as a reporter, is never assume anything and never judge people in a condescending way. Whether it's Bernie Sanders, take him seriously. He could be the nominee. He could be president. Donald Trump, maybe an outsider, maybe a businessman. Take him seriously. Ask him the tough questions because you never know what's going to happen. And I'm so glad Woodward and I had the chance to have a serious, about 90-minute interview with candidate Trump in 2016. I think it's one of the longest interviews Trump's ever given. And that interview, you can read the transcript online. It's so revealing because Woodward forces Trump to talk and talk about how he would govern, how he thinks through the world. Woodward thought the interview was so interesting to him as a reporter that he ended up teaching a whole class at Yale University just off the transcript of that interview.
Fascinating.
That interview has stood with Woodward to this day. And to keep the story short, one of the times Trump's talking to us and Trump turns his head and he goes, "You know, Bob, I do bring rage out of people," because we were talking about why he makes people so angry. He goes, I always have. I bring the rage out. I bring it out I bring it out. And Woodward turned to me after, he said that comfort with sparking rage in people, the almost welcoming of rage is striking to see in an American politician. It's striking to see in a human being. And that it stuck with Woodward. And so when he came up with the title of his new book, he didn't take a quote from his 99 hours of interviews with President Trump from the last year. He took a quote from that interview of March 2016. And if you open the first page of Bob Woodward's #1 bestseller right now, Rage, the first page has a quote, "Rage, I bring it out, I always have. Donald John Trump to Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, March 2016.
Fascinating. Well, it's those anecdotes that make these conversations so interesting. So we already have 57 questions waiting for us. So I'm going to jump right in, Bob. First question I'm seeing here. What do you think of the Democrats learning the wrong lessons, such as a centrist candidate being the answer, when this is an anti-Trump electorate more than anything else the DNC and Biden campaign has done?
It's a great question. And I covered the Democratic primary. I interviewed all the major candidates for Washington Post Live. And when the history books are written of this time, there will be many, many books, thousands on President Trump. But the Democratic decision around the South Carolina primary earlier this year to suddenly winnow the field, even though Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders did so well in Iowa and New Hampshire, to winnow the field in South Carolina in a sudden move because Congressman Jim Clyburn endorses Biden, Biden wins South Carolina, and for the whole party to, out of the blue, consolidate around Biden, it tells us a lot about the Democratic Party. And to the questioner, it's really an important question to ask now. Was it the right decision for the Democrats? Was that decision made strategically, assuming the electorate against President Trump would want a moderate, want a pair of steady hands that's associated with President Obama? As I say, that reviving that Obama coalition is so critical for the Democrats. Was it a strategic decision? Was it an ideological decision? Did they say they needed to stave off the rise to the left, at least for now, for 4 years? Make sure Sanders doesn't get the nomination and move toward Biden. And if Vice President Biden is defeated, along with Senator Harris, that decision around the South Carolina primary will be scrutinized for decades to come. Why did the Democrats go with Biden? Was that the strategic choice that people, as I said, assumptions are sometimes worthless in politics, sometimes they're right, sometimes they fall apart. The assumption that Biden was the best positioned candidate, who's to say? To this day, many of Senator Sanders' closest supporters confide in me that they believe if Sanders was the nominee, he'd be doing better in the sense of getting more working class Republicans who aren't ideological or conservative to come to the Democratic side with the promise of Medicare for all, that Sanders would have the energy with young people on issues like climate change and immigration, that Sanders would have a different coalition than Biden. Biden, as a moderate Democrat, is trying to stoke that Obama coalition back together again. And that's the bet the Democrats are making, that one, it still exists, and that was Senator Harris, a black woman on the ticket who's respected lawmaker from California, that he can get the black vote back to where it was in 2012 and 2008, and that he can also win over some suburban voters with his own pitch, his moderate demeanor. You saw Vice President Biden in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania this week talk a lot about bipartisanship. But we live in such a turbulent time that when I talked to Democratic voters in Iowa, I went out there, I was with Senator Sanders in Burlington, Vermont, just before the pandemic started in late February and early March. That was my last real trip before this terribleness began. I was in Vermont with Senator Sanders. And the energy around his campaign was very real. And Biden has handled it in sometimes a dismissive way. We heard him at the first debate say, "I beat the socialist. I am the Democratic Party." And he is the nominee. But how that all plays out with the electorate, the bet is that Democrats need to win over moderates. And the Clyburn moment was the moment. But we'll have to see if the bet was right. And the future of Democratic politics could be shaped in the image of Biden. But Biden himself has said he's a transitional figure in Democratic politics. And I believe the raging wars of the Republican Party between now and 2024 will be very real and very rough, and so will the wars on the Democratic side.
Great, thank you. Interesting next question around young Republicans. This person asserts that young Republicans are speaking out about the need to address climate change. And how much influence do you think that they could have on the GOP going forward?
It's going to be an uphill battle for young Republicans who believe in climate change, particularly if they believe in collective action on the issue. When I first got to know President Trump, he didn't really have an ideology beyond being a contrarian, a Republican/Democrat who didn't like the establishment media, though he did crave their attention. What we saw is a Republican who was slowly now in the primary process in 2016 come around the idea of nationalism. And I bring that up because, as we saw from Vice President Pence in the debate, some Republicans, like VP Pence, will acknowledge that the climate is changing, but won't get into details, won't acknowledge the scientific consensus on it, will just give a very surface answer on climate change. And the Trump administration, like any administration, what matters more than just the surface rhetoric is the actions they take, and to remove themselves from the Paris Climate Accords. You remember the famous rally the president had, I care more about Pittsburgh than Paris. And that kind of mentality on climate change has seeped into the Republican Party in a deep way. And maybe some younger Republicans who are running in places like the Central Valley, who see the agricultural issues, who see the fire issues up close, will shape the Republican conversation. But a Republican Party that for now, and probably for the time being, takes a nationalist position when it comes to collective action on climate change, it's going to be a search for young Republicans to really fill in the gaps and to make their way into the leadership of the party, because the leadership of the party right now just isn't where the younger voters are on climate change. Climate change in the Republican Party is still framed as something, if you take action on it, means taxation. And they believe they can score points on the Democrats by framing the Green New Deal as a burden on taxpayers, as a burden on businesses, as a burden on perhaps family farmers in places like the Central Valley. And the Republican Party is much more interested in going more in the protectionist direction on trade and the skeptical direction on climate change.
Great, thank you. This next question is from a few people, actually. They're asking if you think that Joe Biden would have had a better chance of winning this upcoming election if he had chosen a different running mate for the VP position.
Well, he had many different contenders on his short list. One of them was was Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, and she comes from a battleground state, and that's often the calculus you get to. You see the people making. Do they want someone who has a certain profile? Senator Harris, a former prosecutor, respected, would be the first Black woman on a ticket, or do they want someone who really hits a state like a Gretchen Whitmer, or someone with a real ability as a debater like Senator Harris or Mayor Buttigieg was considered at one point before Biden made the decision that he must pick a woman. We've seen the vice president commit to picking a woman as a running mate and picking a Black woman as his first Supreme Court nominee should he win the White House. The vice presidents, though, throughout history have not really shaped the presidential races in huge ways. That's not to dismiss the vice presidential picks this year or in any year, but voters rarely make decisions based on who's number two on the ticket, like with Senator Harris, who can get a lot of women and young people perhaps excited, Black Americans who are excited to see, and white Americans, Americans of all races, excited to see someone of her background, of her roots, of her gender, succeed in American politics at the highest level. And just like Sarah Palin got a lot of conservative women excited in 2008, but it always comes down to the nominees. I will say, as a reporter, reporting on the VP search, that's got to be, it's the most fun and the toughest thing for me to do. I remember in 2012, someone asked me right before we got on here if the flowers in my shot, I don't know if you can see them, but the red flowers in my shot, if they're real or not. I said, are you joking? I'm a 34-year-old, almost 35-year-old single reporter male. Those are definitely fake flowers. And that reminds me of this story about why I'm single. I'm probably a workaholic. I'll acknowledge it, I am. And in 2012, this does tie back to the VP story. Bear with me. I'm seeing a movie starring Zach Galifianakis and Will Ferrell in the summer of 2012 called The Campaign. And I'm in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm seeing a movie with a date. Her name was Jennifer. I'll not say her last name to protect her from this terrible story. But we're at a date. It's late. It's 11 o'clock at night, 11:30. The movie's almost over, probably 30 minutes left. And I get a text message, and I say, Paul Ryan has been picked. It says Paul Ryan's going to be picked, and he's going to be announced tomorrow morning in Virginia, in Norfolk, which is Southern Virginia, about 4 hours away, 4.5 hours away. And I look at my date, and I say, Jen, I have to leave the movie. And I'll drive you home, but I have to leave. I got to go drive down to Norfolk, Virginia right now so I can make the announcement at 6, 7 a.m. She said, you're joking. I said, I'm not joking. I have to go. And she said, well, I'm going to stay and watch the movie. I said, that's fine, but I really have to go. She said, you're joking. I said, I'm not joking. I went and I drove down to Norfolk. I did not get another date, but I did make the announcement of Paul Ryan. But was it worth it? Paul Ryan, I thought, he could be vice president. He wasn't vice president. Did he affect the Republican ticket in 2012? Probably not. Was Romney going to win over all those fiscal conservatives anyway? Probably. The vice presidential search, it's a great story for political junkies like myself. But I wanted to note about Ryan, it brings up another story on reporting. I was tipped off by someone very close to Mitt Romney in 2012 that this was months before the pick was formally announced, probably 2 months before, that the pick had been made. Paul Ryan had been privately told. They made all the arrangements for him to sneak out of his home in Janesville, Wisconsin. It was Ryan. And I said to my source, who I'm friendly with to this day, I said, hey, I appreciate it, but how solid is this? They said 100% solid. And look, I was almost 10 years younger at the time. And if you scoop the vice presidential pick, it's a feather in your cap career-wise. John King, the CNN anchor, famously scooped in 1992 that Clinton had picked Gore. And he always tells a story about how he got a text message with the letters with numbers on them, but he didn't realize what the numbers were until late. He realized the numbers were signifying the letters G-O-R-E. But I got this tip about Paul Ryan, and it was one source very close to Romney at the time. And they said, go with it. It'll make your career to get this scoop. And I went to my editor and I said, sorry, I got one source. That's it. I went to the Romney people. They wouldn't play ball. No one else would play ball. So I had one source. And I went back to my source and said, can you give me any other source? And they said, no, but it's 100% solid. And I didn't go with it. I didn't go with it because it was one source. And I missed that story. But it was the right thing to do because as a journalist, even when your source tells you it's 100%, you have to trust a good source, but verify. Verify always. Get a second source. Get a third source if possible. And sometimes my business, you score a big scoop. You get something that's really groundbreaking. And sometimes you get breaks. One of my big breaks was discovering Don McGahn, the former White House counsel, was being interviewed by Robert Mueller. And I was staking out Mueller's office in D.C., and I saw McGahn with his long hair in the back of a car zoom into a private parking garage. And I called the White House. I said, I saw McGahn at Mueller's office. They said, no, you didn't. I said, I saw him. I saw him in his long hair. And they said, damn, you caught him. You did see him. But I didn't get the Ryan scoop. I got the McGahn scoop. That's the way it works sometimes.
That's a great story. And as you're speaking about scoops and the importance of having more than one source and stories, there are several questions coming in around the role of the media, right, during a political campaign. And this one person writes that as someone who has spent a lifetime in politics, even I have come to understand why the quote unquote average person hates politics. What role do you think media play in trying to portray everything that is happening today, but in a way that doesn't disillusion voters?
It is the central challenge of the media today. And I don't have any easy answer, but I do try my best to set an example in my own work to be civil and to be vigorous. And I believe I firmly believe this. You can be both. And I'm not here to lecture anyone else in my business, but I will say when I'm reporting for the Washington Post or hosting Washington Week for the past 3.5 years on PBS on Friday nights, I try to be both civil and vigorous. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you go to the Washington Post newsroom, there's a big banner that hangs above the central area of the newsroom. We call it the hub. And the banner is a quote, and it's from Ben Bradley, the late editor of the Washington Post. And the quote is this: "The truth, no matter how bad it is never as dangerous as a lie in the long run. The truth, no matter how bad it is never as dangerous as a lie in the long run." That hangs over reporters' heads at the Washington Post. And it's an important quote because in this day and age where we're dealing with disinformation, misinformation, social media, conspiracy campaigns, attacks from both political parties, erosions of the press's institutional integrity, the politicization of the press, we still need to do our most important job, which is to inform. And that means, at times, calling a lie, and calling racism, and not dancing around tough truths, to tell the truth, to investigate, to probe, to shine a light on people in power, regardless of who it affects, regardless of how bad it may seem, as Bradley said, because there's nothing more dangerous than dancing around the truth. And so in our coverage of white supremacy, we call it racism. We call it white supremacy. When President Trump or anyone else lies, an outright lie, we call it a lie. But you can call something a lie and be tough as a reporter without being political. And I know some in this audience may be skeptical that the press can do that and do it well. But I believe, as much as I'm the first to acknowledge I make mistakes, I have flaws, no doubt about it, there's an approach the press can take by being vigorous, but being civil. And that's the way to really carry on, because the hardest thing in the media to understand is that we cover the biggest stories of our time. We're in the dugout of American history and world history. As you said, Patty, I've been with Vice President Pence and President Trump around the world. I've seen them interact with world leaders. I've been in the halls of Congress. I've been in inaugurations. I've been in the Oval Office for interviews. I see it. I have these thrilling experiences, these sometimes tough experiences, covering the big stories, but I am not the story. Tonight, you're all kindly enough to hear my story and my storytelling, but at the end of the day, I'm not the story. And the press, if it remembers that, always does better. And sometimes that means not getting engaged in the political firefight. Sometimes the left, someone will say that Senator Sanders, I have a professional, good relationship with. I've interviewed him many times. Check out those interviews online. He gives us 30, 40 minutes on video at the Washington Post to have in-depth conversations. But he also will rail against the Post and others at times as corporate media. We know that President Trump routinely, daily, hourly, will call the Washington Post and others fake news, and he'll go after us in extreme ways. My approach, and others may disagree, is to shrug it off. When someone calls me fake news, I listen. I don't engage or become defensive. That's important too. I don't accept the logic of being called fake news. I think it's important to just carry on with the reporting. Sometimes I think I get too much credit for just doing my job. If you go to a car mechanic or a doctor, you're not expecting them to tell you their politics. You're expecting them to fix your car or fix your arm or give you a prescription. They have a job to do, not to just unload on you politically. And as a reporter, it's my job to hold people in power to account and to do my job, and then step away and let you hopefully figure out what you want to do as a citizen based on the facts. And you don't always have time to talk to the people in power or accumulate those facts. That's my job. But my job ends there, at least in my view.
That's great perspective to hear. I think a lot of times folks are curious around the inner workings of reporting and how you draw that distinction. So thank you for answering that. One of the shorter questions here, but one I think could be on people's minds, is around the outcome of the election in terms of how are you and other media outlets preparing for not just election day, but in the ensuing days? And what would you think would constitute enough of a landslide for Biden so that Trump would not contest it in the courts?
It would need to be a pretty significant landline for President Trump to just walk away. President Trump has spent months going after the U.S. Postal Service, attacking mail-in voting. But again, the fact here is that there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud. I know some of you in this audience may point to anecdotal evidence, and there is anecdotal evidence of voter fraud. But the FBI director, Christopher Wray, a nonpartisan figure, someone who was appointed by President Trump, just recently testified under oath before Congress that there is no widespread evidence of voter fraud. Yet still today, President Trump said he disagreed with his own FBI director and believes there is widespread voter fraud. So that's the atmosphere we're all encountering just 25, 26 days before the election. The president clashing with the FBI director he appointed over facts, the facts about the integrity of the election. And the president is prepared to clash not only with his FBI director, but in court, state by state. And this is something to go back to the beginning of our conversation tonight. I talked about living history. We're now seeing not only the 25th Amendment, something that has been on the dustiest shelf of the American House for decades, rarely ever spoken of, the 25th Amendment, now part of conversation. So is the idea of electors and how will the Electoral College handle things if there are ongoing court cases. If states are not clear about the outcome and the Electoral College meets to certify the election and Congress meets to certify the election, how will they vote? Will we have faithless electors, the idea that's been challenged in the court? What happens in these situations? How will the Electoral College function? Will the electors in the Electoral College abide by the popular will in their state? And who will define what is the popular will in their state? Hopefully the Secretary of State would certify the elections in these cases. But all of this could be challenged. And the Republican National Committee, I had a story a few months ago, has 50,000 people prepared to watch the polls around the country at least. And the Democrats themselves have an army of lawyers prepared to monitor the election. So to answer your question, it would have to be a significant landslide where it was humbling, to say the least, for either Vice President Biden or President Trump, should they be defeated, for this election not to be carried on for at least a week or two, because there is still going to be a count of mail-in voting. There's been a ton of early voting, between 5 and 6 million votes already cast in a nation of 300 million, and more to come in the coming weeks. But still, many states are going to be waiting to see, did the absentee ballot, did the mail-in ballots arrive? And so one of the things we're talking about in the media is patience, to wait. The Washington Post uses the Associated Press, which is often patient, will take its time. And the TV networks themselves, who also call races, will likely be taking their time, because no one wants to get too far ahead of this if it's a narrow election and it's going to be fought in the courts.
That's a great point. I just wonder how patient people will be in terms of social media. Things move so quickly. And I think folks, for the most part, are accustomed to instantaneous news. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. So Bob, I do have time for at least one more question. There's so many around your reporting and what it's like to be a reporter these days that could almost be a whole nother session. But at this point, since we're focusing on the elections and what have you, one of the last questions, at least, that I will read tonight is around the outcome, again, of the elections. If President Trump, this is the question, if he were to lose, how quickly do you think that Republicans would distance themselves from him, if at all? And would the GOP seek to rebrand themselves?
The peaceful transfer of power, like so much in America, has gone unquestioned since our founding. My father started his career as a police officer in Washington, D.C., a metropolitan police officer. That's where he met my mother, in Washington. And in 1974, in August 1974, my dad, Tom Costa, would recall growing up that he saw Nixon's helicopter, Marine One, take off from the White House and fly to Andrews Air Force Base to get on a plane to go to California as a private citizen after he resigned in disgrace due to Watergate in 1974. And that was fascinated me as a young man to hear that story, because that was the peaceful transfer of power in action. It wasn't something that was a fantasy or a scenario in a political science class. It was a reality. It happened. It was there in the history books we were reading. It was there, a story my father shared, that even in a dark moment with a president resigning, Gerald Ford was able to become president without the military getting involved, without riots in the streets. And that told you a lot about America, that this was a country that even in the darkest times could carry on and function. And what we're going to watch now in this election, you are living through history, is a testing of that functioning. Can this country carry on if President Trump is defeated, and whether it's a big way or small way, if he's certified as the loser of this election by Congress, by the Electoral College, and he chooses not to go or chooses not to accept it, will this country carry on as it always has? Now, there's a big difference between President Trump saying he doesn't agree with the result and actively contesting the result.
Right.
And here's what I mean by that, is that so long when I've covered President Trump, Mr. Trump, going up to visit him at Trump Tower for interviews, he's protective of his brand. He wants to be seen as a winner. He wants a future in politics, in American media, in culture after the White House, whether it's 2025 or 2021. And so his allies tell me, oh, don't worry about him. He may never concede the election, but he'll physically leave the White House. And they said it's all about just him protecting his brand. That's what he wants to do. He'll never concede because he doesn't want to ever accept that he lost, but he'll leave. He understands how the system works. And that's kind of the optimistic, the view in Trump's inner circle. There is another view, though, among some Republicans and many Democrats, that they fear that this president, who walked with a Bible across Lafayette Square with military leaders amid a racial reckoning in this country to have a photo shoot, this is a president who's working with the Attorney General to send federal agents into American cities, that they don't think this is a president who's necessarily ready to walk away, that this is a president who will just make a point for his brand and then fade into the sunset and get on Marine One like Richard Nixon in 1974. So there is a tension, a divide in the debate right now among my top sources in Washington, Democrat and Republican, about how will this ultimate outsider, this president who has shattered every norm, will he shatter the ultimate norm, that peaceful transition of power? We'll have to wait and see.
Indeed, we will. Thank you so much for your thoughtful analysis, Bob. Very interesting. And to our audience and our guests, friends of Fresno State, thank you so much for joining us tonight for the Fresno State President's Lecture Series. And before we sign off, I wanted to let you know that on October 26th, we'll have another intriguing lecture that will be with National NPR White House correspondent, Tamara Keith. She will be speaking with us, just like Bob did, on a virtual format on October 26th, and we'll be pushing out information around that tomorrow. And Bob, it's always such a pleasure to hear from you. And we hope that once this pandemic eases and you're in town next, that perhaps we can grab a meal with you at Just Joe's.
Tri-tip.
I'm
not going to forget that now.
Exactly. So audience members, thanks again. Please stay in touch with Fresno State and have a great night. Thank you very much.